8 o'clock, bright and early here on a beautiful day in Panama City Beach. I call this special meeting to order for the Municipal Impact Fee Workshop. Ms. Fazzoni, please call roll.
Councilmember Coburn.
Here.
Councilman Register.
Yes, ma'am.
Vice Mayor Jarman.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilman Casto.
Yes, ma'am.
Mayor Teddemer.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure.
Get that. Do we have folks out there? Maybe we can make sure everyone can get in. All right. Well, we're going to move on to the presentation, the Municipal Impact Fee Study by Sean Ocasio, Senior Manager at Reptelis. Yeah, Charlie, we do that in the normal meeting. Okay.
Good morning.
Morning, Sean.
Good morning.
For the record, Sean Ocasio, Reptelis Financial Consultants. I'm a senior manager with the firm. I was a part actually of the team along with Henry Thomas, who designed the fees that you currently have in place. So I've been working with the city for a while on these types of analyses and also on your utility side as well. So a little outline on the presentation for this morning. We're going to cover a little bit of background information on impact fees with respect to some legal considerations, some changes in the statutes that have come up recently in the past few years. We're going to talk about the overall calculation methodology. Then we're going to talk a little bit about implementation considerations, then go into the proposed fees for each of the various municipal services that we're looking at. In this case, it's police, fire, parks and recreation, and libraries. And then from there discuss the extraordinary circumstances that we think are associated with the implementation of this analysis, and then some time for Q&A at the end. So jumping into a little bit of background, what are impact fees, just as some primer. These are fees that are designed to recover the costs of major capital investment in municipal facilities. This would be in the case of, like the police department, major facilities like the headquarters, major vehicles, things like that. On the fire side, it'd be, fire stations, fire apparatus and supporting items. Parks and recreation would be facilities, land and activities. Library would be the main structure of the library itself. And so what these fees are meant for is they're paid by new development, and they're designed to recover the cost of that growth brings into the community. So that as your community grows, you have to invest in more facilities on the police side, on the fire side, on parks and recreation, and so on. And so it's a method of recovering some of those costs associated with growth from the growth itself.
Yeah. And so just to highlight that, they're paid by new development.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You can use these fees to then pay for a portion, growth-related costs, as well as even a portion of expansion-related debt. So if you financed any capital projects that were growth-related, to the extent they were growth-related, you could use some of these impact fee revenues to also pay a portion of the annual debt service associated with those items. So you have a couple of uses for these. What you can't do with them is use them for operating expenses or to fulfill any sort of service level deficiencies. So this is only associated with growth and expansion. In terms of the benefits of having impact fees, they're very important to a community as a funding mechanism, and they also, having them at the right size for your community, having them calculated regularly and updated appropriately, allow for growth to pay its own way, of course, but also to the extent you have them right sized in your community, these fees can go towards helping keep potential cost on existing residents lower. So for instance, to the extent that you have these fees in place and at an appropriate level, then as you're taking on these growth-related projects, adding new stations or adding new facilities and amenities, the impact to the existing taxpayer is reduced because you have these fees in place. Otherwise, without these fees, all those costs of growth are then borne by your existing residents. So there's some good benefits to having these fees and having them right-sized for your community. So with respect to legal considerations, the impact fees are governed by the Florida Impact Fee Act. It was codified in 2006, and since then it's been amended numerous times, with some of the more recent updates in 2021, 2024, and even this year being some of the more significant changes to that act. Just some items associated with the act itself. There are certain requirements built in. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but some of the major ones I did want to touch on. The calculation itself has to be based on a study that's then based on most recent and localized data to the community. That's defined as being within 4 years of the current update. And you also have a timeline to complete the analysis. You have 12 months from study initiation. With respect to the recent and localized component, we believe our study fulfills that requirement. All the data that we used in this analysis is based on the most recent accounting records and fixed asset registers, the most recent capital plans, your call data for the police and fire departments, and so on. So everything falls within that threshold. Some other items here, limited administrative charges on the collection of the impact fees to actual cost. There's an implementation delay that's required of 90 days. That's essentially a grace period for when you adopt the fees. You have to wait 90 days before you can actually start to collect them. This is to allow the building community to adjust its existing inventory prices and account for those fees on the next batch, if you will. One of the other big issues, the government has the burden of proof in the event of a challenge of an impact fee. That's something that changed a while back. It used to be the opposite, where the person who was challenging had to prove it wrong. Now the municipality has to prove that the fees are defensible. One other thing on timing with the fees, you can't charge these before the issuance of a building permit, so you have to charge them at that point in time. Now, some of the changes that took place in 2021, there was some significant changes in the fees. They mainly related to what you could include in the fee calculation, but also in terms of implementation. So when it comes to implementing the fees, what the statute now says is, if you're calculating and proposing an increase in an impact fee, compared to the existing fee, if you have an increase of up to 25%, that increase then has to be phased in over a 2-year period of time evenly. If you have an increase over 25%, but up to 50%, then that increase has to be phased in over a 4-year period of time evenly, so 12.5% a year. And they also added to that if it's an increase, if you're proposing an increase of over 50%, well, you're capped at the 50% level. So you can't get an increase of over 50% in essentially a standard operating situation, if you will. Now, one thing they also built into that statute change in 2021 was something on here noted as extraordinary circumstances. And so what that relates to is, well, one of the nice things is they didn't specifically define what constitutes an extraordinary circumstance, so they leave that up to the governing body to define that and have findings of it. But what it allows you to do is, if you do implement through the extraordinary circumstance provision, then you can sidestep those fee increase thresholds and that maximum, that 50% cap, and you can implement the full fee increase at one time. One thing with that, there are going to be some changes coming to that rule again. They were passed this year, and they take effect January 1st of 2026. So some of the provisions there will change. I'll cover that on the next slide. One other thing here is they also said you can't increase an impact fee more than once every 4 years. So they're setting a threshold by which you can't do it any sooner. Then that'll be important because there's another provision that's coming in that is changing. So with the extraordinary circumstance provision in its existing form, it's a set of procedural requirements as well. There, you have to have a demonstrated need study that justifies the increases and the need to have them implemented sooner than the 2 to 4 year phasing schedule. You have to have 2 publicly noticed workshops specifically devoted to talking about those circumstances. And then if you're going to pass the impact fees under that provision, you have to have a 2/3 vote of the governing body. What it's changing to now is they're making it a little more stringent, and they're slowing down the rate at which you can implement. What it now will be, starting January 2026, is you can still pursue the full increase. So that they didn't take away from local governments. But what they did do is say, you still have to phase it in over time. Now, it doesn't prescribe as the original method, whether it's a 2-year or a 4-year. They just give you the option of phasing it in over a 2 or over 4-year period of time. They also made it more stringent to get support to implement under that approach, because now it requires, or it will require, a unanimous vote of the governing body, whereas before it was a 2/3 vote of the governing body. And the other thing that'll also take effect is, if the local government hasn't increased its impact fees in 5 years, then you simply can't implement impact fees using that extraordinary circumstance provision. So why did I mention the 4-year thing important on the prior slide? So you can't do any study to increase impact fees, before the 4-year threshold. You have only 1 year to complete and implement the study, and if you exceed it and you go to 5 years in the future, you won't be able to use extraordinary circumstances. So they're really kind of bookending some of the terms there.
Is that, does that lock in, so you can never use an extraordinary fee if you, an extraordinary circumstance, if after 5 years you haven't raised fees or adjusted fees?
Just on that next one.
Just on the next one, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So some of the, excuse me. I apologize if my voice gives out. I had surgery a while back and it's still coming back to me. In terms of some impact fee criteria, part of the statute also relates to that there has to be what's called a dual rational nexus. It's a fancy way of saying there has to be a linkage, if you will, that the fees, if you're going to design impact fees, they have to be based on growth-related capital costs, and then the revenues that you're then going to collect from those fees have to be used on growth-related projects. So you're trying to link the cost related to growth and the usage of the revenues associated with that. As I mentioned before, you can't use impact fees to fund capital deficiencies or pay for any operating costs, but you can use them for growth-related capital. And impact fees must be based on a reasonable level of service standard that you are attaining. So you can't design a fee based on a level of service that you're not currently meeting, because it's not fair, and in that sense you'd be funding a deficiency, if you will, with the fees, and that's not allowed. A quick overview of the fee calculation methodology without getting too in the weeds on it. Essentially what we're designing is a cost on a per unit basis. And so in order to do that, we have to analyze the cost side of the equation and then the unit side of the equation. So in terms of the unit side, we do a projection of residential population and dwelling units, developed non-residential square footage. In the case of the city, we also have a projection of visiting population, since that's such a significant factor in your community. We then review the level of service criteria for the various services. In the case of parks and recreation, it's looking at acres per thousand of population. In terms of looking at police level of service, that would be on an officers per thousand basis. So we're looking at levels of service here. And then we're analyzing the cost side. And so in order to do that, essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at all the investment that you have to date for the various municipal services. So all the assets that are on the books at a fixed point in time and what the current investment is there. And then some of the things in the statute also say there are certain costs you can't include. They're smaller, shorter-lived assets. So we exclude those from the calculation to get a net existing investment in those various facilities. We then also look forward in time and we look at your capital plans, and that's your planned future projects associated with taking care of those various departments. We look at those projects to see what we can include in the fee and what we must exclude from the fee. Again, we can't include any renewal and replacement type projects. It all has to be expansion related or new assets. So we go through that exercise. We account for any grant funding on the capital plan or on the existing assets to get at a net cost number, a net bucket of includable costs that we're looking at for the period. And then from there, it's essentially a division exercise of cost per unit and then scaling it appropriately, which we'll get a little more to as we go on each fee group. Your fees are then applied on a per unit basis. In the case of residential units, it's per dwelling unit. On the non-residential side, we're looking at modifying that approach from a square footage basis for all non-residential properties to having some subcategories within that, which we'll delve into in a bit. One thing I did want to mention, when we take that cost bucket, one of the other steps that we take in that exercise is we bifurcate the cost between what's residential related and what's non-residential related, so that then we have those two buckets to then allocate from. In order to do that exercise, we use different data points. So in the case of, let's say, police and fire, we're looking at the call data for the departments. We're also looking at the developed square footage of the community, so that comes from your property appraiser records. We're also looking at some commuter type statistics of essentially an estimate of where people spend their time. That's tracked by the Census Bureau in terms of people who live in the city and work in the city, people who work in the city who live outside the city, trying to account for all the inflows of people. And the idea being where you have more people, you have more potential demand for various services.
Okay, just to be clear, you said you're going to go into this later, but I just want to touch on this now. You said the residential cost is per dwelling unit?
Yes, sir.
What is a dwelling unit?
That would be either a single-family home or an apartment, townhome, something like that. So it's the full living unit.
Okay. And the three factors were demand for services, some sort of where people move around to identify where people are, and then what was the third factor?
Developed square footage. So it's the you can think of it as the heated square footage or structural square footage of all properties within the city, based on the records from the property appraisers.
Non-residential square
Well, we look at residential square footage as a part of that because the record includes all square footage per parcel. And then because they also have land use codes associated with each property in the master listing, we then know what's residential related properties versus non-residential related properties. So that's one of the
So two
weighting
different
factors.
buckets. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and so the calculation's the same, and then that's what is used to split it into two buckets, residential versus non-residential. Is my
Yes, sir.
understanding, is that
Yep.
accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
And so, for those factors, kind of help me understand what each of those factors is trying to capture. So
Sure.
the first is demand for services. I think that's fairly obvious.
Yes, sir.
The second one is where people spend their time, right? So kind of a modification of demand for services. People spend more time at home versus in the office or, at a retail establishment. And the third factor is total developed land usage for a particular category, residential versus non-residential. And what's that trying to capture?
Sure. Well, just to elaborate on the other 2 points, and then I'll jump into that one
Yeah,
as well.
perfect.
So with the call data, that's very clearly a measure of demand, right? Where you have a call for service with the police or fire department, clearly there's demand there. What I'll say is the shortcoming with that type of statistic is that it doesn't account for the fact that you have people who still need the availability of police and fire service, even though they didn't have a call. So just because there wasn't a call for a certain property doesn't mean they still don't need that service available to them, and costs should then be allocated to them. So calls is a good measurement of demand, but it's not a perfect measurement to allocate things across everything. So then we look at where people spend their time, which would be the Census Bureau tracks an on-the-map tool that essentially relates to commuter statistics in terms of where people are coming into the city. So people who live in the city, who work in the city, and people who work in the city, who live out of the city, and people who live in the city, who work out. There's some tracking that they do there to give us some estimates of effectively where people are. And then the developed square footage, that's representative of, if we think about, let's say, police and fire service on the police side, there's an element of, property protection or crime prevention, and the same holds true on the fire side. While maybe the majority of your calls are more EMS related, there's still a fire component, of course, and it's trying to account for that. So again, it's trying to think of, you have risk on the property side that needs to be measured and accounted for. You definitely have it on the people side, and then of course you also have the actual demand itself, which, while it measures the demand that actually occurred in the surveyed period of time, it doesn't account for everyone. So it's trying to layer all those together to try to get a bit more of a comprehensive weighting factor, so that we're not either leaving costs on the away from ones that maybe should have gotten some, but also trying to balance out the other side.
Okay, so it's to account for availability of services and the benefit derived from availability of services.
That's correct.
Okay.
Continuing on the fee calculation methodology, your current method, you treat all residential dwelling units the same, like I mentioned a moment ago. And on the non-residential side, all residents currently pay a single fee per square footage, regardless of the type of land use that it is. The current study, what we're proposing is taking the non-residential class, if you will, and breaking it into 5 different categories, trying to account for the fact that there are some differences and uniqueness of the demand characteristics of each of those land uses. Easy example I like to use is if you take like a 50,000 square foot Publix or supermarket, that's going to have a lot of people coming in and out, a lot of potential for demand for service, particularly on police and fire EMS. However, if you take a storage warehouse, a simple U-Haul storage facility of similar square footage, that's going to have a lot less traffic, a lot less destinations to it, and a lot less people on site at any given time. And so what the method we're trying to implement here, that we're proposing, is that you have a few different land uses that take into consideration those different demand characteristics and try to weigh the costs accordingly across them, so that you can look at new development and essentially try to be fair with them and say, listen, we're trying to acknowledge for the fact that warehouse is different than general retail, is different than hotel, motel, or industrial warehousing, and so on. In order to do that, to come up with those weighting factors, we rely on information from the Institute of Transportation Engineers. They do these big nationwide traffic surveys, and they look at, they develop trip generation factors. And we use a portion of that trip generation factor as a proxy for demand, the idea of more trips to that particular land use type more people, more demand. Now it is massaged in there to be localized using your square footage statistics. We're looking at, and that's the property appraiser data. And so we're trying to weigh all those factors together to come up with those weightings for those classes. On the unit forecast, if you will, the service area forecast, what we have here is just a projection over time of total estimated combined population. So that's comprised of your permanent residents as well as your average daily visiting population. The split of that number, currently about 21,000 permanent residents, about 57,000 visitors per day on an average basis. So definitely the bulk there is on the visitor side. In terms of the growth being projected between 2025 and 2030, the reason I highlight 2030 there is for our purposes for designing the fee, that's our horizon for the design window. So we're looking at that window of time. And over that period of time, on an average annual basis, we're projecting about 1.6% average annual growth per year. On a total horizon, about 1.34% if we're looking through 2025 through 2050. But again, our design is confined to fiscal year 2030 there.
Goals of growth, previous years, 2022, 2023, 2024, do you have any of that?
Since I can tell you offhand, from 2010 to 2020, you've grown at a rate of about 3.8% per year on an average annual basis. So there has been some pretty material growth in the community over that window of time, probably more heavily on the latter end of that period. One thing I'll mention with that is, if you compare yourselves to the average growth rate of the state average is about 1.5% average annual increase in recent years. So you're definitely well above that.
And you're projecting what?
I'm sorry?
You said you're projecting 1.6?
Yes, sir. In the near term for 2025 through 2030, about 1.6% per year. And the way we develop this is through discussions with the project team on the city side, as well as looking at to some other third-party sources as well. There's the Bureau of Economic and Business Research from the University of Florida. They do population analyses and projections, as does the same university also has the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse. And they also do a projection of housing units over time and population as well. So we're trying to look at other third-party sources as well as discussions with your city staff to come up with this projection over time. So we'll jump into the first major grouping here for police. First thing I'll talk about is on the level of service side. Again, level of service is an indicator of the degree of service provided by a facility or service. Your current level of service, we look at police generally on an officers per 1,000 basis of population. If you look at your total officers as it compares to just permanent residents, you're providing a level of service of just over 4 officers per 1,000. Just for some scale there, the state average, depending on the law enforcement agency type that you're looking at, ranges between about 2 and 2.5 officers per 1,000. So it's higher. However, I'll mention there's a reason for that. Your community is very unique compared to an average community in Florida. You have a very high visiting population. And so if we then look at your officers on a per 1,000 basis to your total average day population, then it comes to about 1.2 officers per 1,000 when we're looking at visiting and permanent population. The department has, as of the analysis, 115 total police-related personnel FTEs, 87 sworn officers. That's what we're including in the calculation, and then 28 administrative or support or non-sworn positions that are not included in the calculation. So when we design the fees for police, we're looking at those 87 FTEs as it relates to the total permanent and visiting population, and that gives us the 1.12 officers per 1,000 there. So as I mentioned earlier, when we're doing these calculations, we're looking at all the costs associated with the various municipal services. In this case, when we look at the existing investment in your police department today, the total existing investment, total assets, so facilities, equipment, vehicles, and so on, is about $12.6 million. Now, we then break that out into 3 major categories: general equipment, vehicle and vehicle-related equipment, and then major facilities. And the reason we do that is as a part of some of the statute changes, when it comes to smaller, shorter, useful life equipment type items, you can no longer include those in an impact fee. It used to be you could. In fact, when we did the last study for the city, that was something that was one of the cost components that is built into your existing fees. But since with the recent changes, you can no longer do that. And so what you'll see there is of that $12.6 million, about $1.2 million of it is related to those smaller equipment type items, and therefore we have those excluded from the calculation. When it comes to vehicles and vehicle-related equipment, there's about $5.3 million of that. We can include the equipment that's directly related to putting a vehicle into service, so that we can include. And so that's in that number, that 5.3 there. And then in terms of major facilities, about $6.1 million. On the forward-looking side, when we're looking at planned future investments, your capital program for the department, over the period we're looking, it's about $11 million. Projects in there include replacement vehicles, new vehicles, mobile command center, substations, and some other items. When we then look at that $11 million in projects, we have to pull out from that number any projects that are associated with renewal and replacements or replacing an existing asset. And so we've done that, and that's about $5.8 million of the calculation that's being excluded. We also then exclude from the calculation any grant funding that you may be getting, because it's not fair to charge for assets that didn't cost you anything in this type of fee. So there's another $1.9 million that's excluded from the calculation as cost-free capital. So when we look at the net amount that we're including from the capital plan and the net amount that we're including from the investment that you have today, we're getting a total net costs recognized of about $14.6 million. We then take that total cost bucket and we come up with an average cost per sworn officer, looking at the various service capabilities of the different asset categories, and we get an average cost of just under $135,000 per officer. We then, looking at your current FTEs and sworn positions today, looking at the forecast period and the growth that we're anticipating and maintaining your existing level of service of 1.14 officers per thousand, that's a projection that gets us 95 officers by the end of our window of time. So we're looking at about $135,000 per officer applied to 95 officers, and that's what gets you the $12.8 million that the then fees are designed around here. So then when we do that bifurcation analysis I mentioned, where we take that 12 million and change, split it between residential and non-residential, and divide it out to get the units, what you'll see here is then the existing fees and the proposed fees. Your existing fees on a per unit basis for residential dwelling units, it's $144 per dwelling. On a non-residential side, it's $880 per 1,000 square feet of development. The fee proposal for residential would be an increase to $194 per dwelling unit, or an increase of about 35%. And on the non-residential side, we're actually seeing decreases in the fee on an overall basis. But breaking out into these 5 categories, we have industrial warehousing at $26 per 1,000 square feet, institutional land use properties at $47 per 1,000 square feet. Hotel motel would be charged on a per room basis. That's $203 per room. Office buildings would be $220 per 1,000 square feet, and retail and food services would be $628 per 1,000 square feet. So that'll scale based on the size of whatever the development for that particular item would be. One thing I'll mention here, we're seeing an increase on the residential and a decrease overall on the non-residential side. It has to do with those data questions that you actually asked earlier in the presentation related to the cost allocation mechanisms that we're looking at, the call data, the square footage data, and the commuter employment data. In terms of overall comparability, this is just a small comparison survey of other communities and their police impact fees, specifically for residential dwelling units. What you'll see here is presently, of the ones that we surveyed that did charge fees, you were the lowest on the comparison at 144. You'd be moving up on that comparison, still well below the average of $314 per dwelling unit. You'd be up to 194. With these, one thing I'll mention is with any kind of impact fee, the comparison is just a snapshot and a point in time. And as other places are looking at updating these, their relative positions are also going to change over time. We're seeing very significant increases, particularly in communities that are going to have very significant capital investment in a certain department or another. I work with a community locally. They're planning on doing a $100 million public safety facility. So correspondingly, their police impact fees and fire impact fees are moving up quite a bit. So it's a function of what's in the plan at the time that the fees are designed. Switching gear to fire rescue. Again, quick discussion on level of service here. Your fire department currently has an ISO rating, class 2. For this, the lower the number, the better the score. So that's a really good rating that you have for your community here in your department. In terms of FTEs, as of the time of the analysis, there's 83 FTEs comprised of 59 firefighting and rescue personnel and 24 administrative and support staff. If we were to look at that on a per 1,000 of population basis, 2.81 fire personnel per 1,000 permanent residents, or about 0.76 fire personnel if we include existing residents as well as visiting. In terms of the standard, there's the NFPA 1710 standard for turnout time that the city meets, 60 seconds, 90% of the time or less. And then because of the uniqueness of your community with all the visiting population, there's not a set response time overall for the department. So just something to note there. But again, the level of service that you're providing the community with an ISO rating 2, it's a very good quality service. Same discussion here on the cost and investment side. Existing investment in the department is $13 million. Again, when we break them into those 3 major categories, you have general equipment at about $1 million, which was excluded from the analysis. You have vehicles and vehicle-related equipment. That's about $4.7 million, and major facilities of about $6.9 million. We're then also making some retirement adjustments to that because of what's in the capital plan, which I'll get to in a moment, but those retirement adjustments are about $500,000. In terms of then the forward-looking side of the costs, about $21.7 million in the forward-looking capital plan. Projects include in there major ones, station number 31 and 32, rebuilds and upgrades. So what we're doing there, because you may recall a moment ago I said we can't include any sort of renewal and replacement type cost, but we can include expansion. So what we've done is, as a part of those projects in the analysis, we've made sure to look at the differential in square footage for those structures and only allocate associated the cost with only allocating the cost associated based on the increase in the square footage. So what's being expanded upon for those facilities.
Okay, yeah, so it's the additional square footage for the new facilities.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of cut out the old facility from the new facility and took the additional.
Yes, sir.
All right.
We're then netting out about $6.5 million of grant funding. Again, like I mentioned before, you can't build into the fee anything that didn't cost you anything. So excluding about $7.3 million in renewal and replacements for a total of about $7.9 million in includable costs from that $21.7 million. So when we take the includable cost of your existing investment and then of your planned future investment, that's total net cost of about $19.5 million. When we look at that on a per firefighter basis, it's just under $300,000 per firefighter. When we look at your level of service and what you're providing through 2030, that would be 65 personnel. So the total cost in this case are the same at $19.5 million. That'll be included in the design of the fees. So in terms of your existing fire fees for residential on a per dwelling unit basis, current fee is $249 per dwelling unit. That would be increasing to $292. That's about a 17% increase in the fee there. On the non-residential side, your current fee is $1,140 per 1,000 square feet, and that would be changing based on the breakout that we see here for industrial warehousing, about $40 per 1,000 square feet, institutional, $73 per 1,000 square feet, hotel motel on a per room basis, so per room it would be $315, office buildings, $342 per 1,000 square feet, and retail, $975 per 1,000 square feet. In terms of overall comparability on this side, again, you're still below the average of the survey that we looked at. The average of other municipalities that were in the survey is about $406. You're still well within that threshold. Again, similar comments. These vary based on what the investment is, when was the last time they updated their fees, what their grant funding was, and so on. Moving forward to Parks and Recreation. So in terms of level of service, your level of service that you target here is on an acreage per 1,000 basis, and it's 5 acres per 1,000 of population. When it comes to that, the Parks and Recreation Department currently has about 3,150 acres of parks-related open space and facilities and everything, across 8 different locations. And the facilities that are encompassed in that acreage, you have outdoor park, community centers, ball fields, playgrounds, nature trails, aquatic center, pickleball court. There's lots of things that you all offer. And you're well exceeding the level of service target that you have for the community. The target there would be a required acreage of about 390 acres per 1,000 residents. You have well above that. So you're meeting that target there. In terms of overall investment, existing investment in Parks and Recreation is about $50 million, $50.4 million. Again, when we break it out into those different categories, general equipment about $2 million, so we're excluding that from the analysis. Major facilities is the bulk of it, of course, at $48.4 million. We do have some grant-funded assets that we're then taking off out of the equation. It's about $2.7 million there for cost-free capital, for a net total of $45.7 million of includable costs that you've invested today, through today. Total planned future investment then, as we're looking forward in time, you have about $25.4 million in projects there. Projects include Frank Brown Park, a community center, the safe room, the connector road, some trails, a new skate park. So those are some of the items that are as a part of that plan. Then we also, again, here we're excluding some items from the calculation, about $7 million in grant funding related to projects, and about $2.8 million in renewal, rehabilitation, or replacement type projects that we have to leave out. So of that $25.4 million, we're including about $15.6 million in the analysis here from that category. So when we look at total existing net investment, total planned future net investment, that gets us $61.3 million that's being included to calculate the fees. Now when we calculate these fees, since it's applied to residential and public lodging, we don't have that same bifurcation issue because there's not calls for service in this case. So it's just based on the units. Your existing residential fee is $867 per dwelling unit. That would be increasing under this proposal to $1,258, or about a 45% increase in the fee. For public lodging, it'd be increasing from its current level of $634 to $898. That would be about a 42% increase in that fee.
Okay, so a 45% and a 42% increase.
Yes, sir. Overall comparability here again, as you can see, middle of the pack, your current fee is well below the average. At the proposed level, it'd be approaching the average of the survey, but still a little bit below it. What I'll say here is, recreation can vary even more across, the state, where there's communities in South Florida where just the recreation fee alone, you're looking at like a $5,000 fee or $6,000 fee. So these can swing wildly. So we tried to keep this one a little more in line with where you all are at, just to kind of show a sampling here. On the library side, this one's a little more straightforward. It's much simpler. You have $2.2 million in existing investment associated with the library. That's the building itself. There's some general equipment, smaller items that are excluded, but essentially it's the $2.2 million there. And then when we were looking forward in time, the only projects associated with that facility was a replacement type project, so we're not including that $175,000. So it's essentially a fee just recovering your existing investment in the library structure. So with that, we're seeing a decrease on this one from $72 per dwelling unit to $62 per dwelling unit, or a decrease of about 14%. The reason for this decrease, because your capital costs have remained, with respect to the library, relatively the same since the last analysis. What's changed is the population growth has been much higher. And so when we're taking that cost per unit over time, the units downstream are much higher than originally anticipated, so that weighs the cost down here. In terms of comparability, this is not a very commonly charged fee. There are some that are charged more than others. Usually the big three, or the big four, is transportation, police, fire, and parks. We will then see some communities have library fees, some communities have general government impact fees. So the survey here is a lot smaller, but again, you'd still be the low one on the comparison here. So recapping all of those items, if we're looking at the calculated residential fees, we have police, fire, parks and recreation, and library here. Their existing fee per dwelling unit, their proposed fee per dwelling unit, and the increases. Again, I'll speak on the percentage term side. Police would be an increase of 35%, or about $50. Fire rescue would be an increase of about 17%, or $43. Parks and recreation, an increase of $391, or about 45%. And library with a slight decrease of $10, or a decrease of about 14%. On the non-residential side, again, we're comparing the 5 land uses for police and fire, and then your existing public lodging for parks and recreation. And we're comparing it to your current fee, which is essentially the same across all of these land uses currently, but it would be changing under the fee proposal approach. So industrial warehousing, on a per 1,000 square foot basis currently, because your fee is $880 per 1,000 square feet, compared to $26, that'd be a 97% decrease in that fee. And you'll see that going down for each of the categories here. I won't list all of them just because there's quite a few to read. One thing I would note, just as an observation, when it comes to hotel motel, on police and for fire, that fee that we're calculating here, the $203 and the $315 for police and fire respectively, is a bit higher than actually the residential fee that we're looking at on a per dwelling unit basis. So while we are seeing decreases in the fees, we are still acknowledging through the method that there is a high demand associated with those property types and those land uses.
Yeah, so it's, the proposal is $194 per dwelling unit for police, but slightly higher for public lodging per room. That's comparing a whole house or a whole apartment to a room.
Yes, sir. In terms of overall combined comparability, then when we take all those comparison slides we looked at a moment ago and we layer them on top of each other, what you'll see here is, again, consistent with the other slides. You're about middle of the survey, moving upwards, but still below the average of the communities that were surveyed, going from $1,332 per residential dwelling unit to $1,806 per residential dwelling unit, compared to the average of about $2,100 and change for the surveyed municipalities. So when we talk implementation then, there's some considerations to be made here. So on the residential side, we're seeing increases, between 17 and 45% with the library fee decreasing by a little bit. On the non-residential side, we're seeing police and fire rescue fees decreasing, with parks and recreation increasing by about 42%. Now you may remember from a number of slides back, I had mentioned, based on the current version of the statute, you can't do an increase of over 50% in a normal situation. Well, in terms of all these fees, none of them are exceeding that particular threshold. But there are still some other things to be mindful of in the community here. So in terms of your growth and how that growth is placing demand for services and facilities on your municipal services. So when it comes to implementation, you essentially have 2 options here. There's implementing the fee increases through the standard statute approach, phasing in over 2 to 4 years evenly, depending on the nature of the level of the fee increase because it's unique to each service type. Decreases can be implemented immediately. But one thing I would note here is in this scenario, if you do follow that 2 to 4 year phasing protocol, then you will be temporarily under-recovering growth-related costs from growth in the early years as you phase to those fee levels. So in the short run, that would be placing an additional burden on your existing residents to cover those costs in that interim period. Because again, it's due to the delay of not getting to that full cost recovery number. The other option is pursuing a full one-time increase through the extraordinary circumstance provision. This is the staff recommended approach here. This is what we're recommending with staff. This would be, the increases could be implemented in one single adjustment as opposed to over a 2 or a 4 year phasing period. There are the procedural requirements, and what we also have on the next slides is reasons that this approach could be justified, specific to your community here. So in terms of the extraordinary circumstances impacting your community, one of the ones, as I mentioned before, you have very high population growth in recent years. If we're looking back, like I mentioned earlier, population growth, in terms of permanent population, not even accounting for the visiting population, which I'll mention in a moment, you have had about 3.8% per year on an average annual basis. Again, compared to the state average, it was about 1.5%, so you're more than double that. One thing I'll mention was when they did attempt to try to define extraordinary, they did two attempts. One of the attempts was in 2023. And what they tried to tie it to was the growth of the community as it relates to the growth average of the state. So it tips the hand, at least that maybe some intent was there to look at growth as a driver in terms of what's considered extraordinary. When they did another proposal, I think it was earlier this year, it was slightly different in its approach, but it's still related to growth. So it's, it seems to show growth seems to be a big item when it comes to defining that, or at least attempting to define it. But the growth in the community is what's driving the need that you have for, adding, services and expanding your existing services, investing in all of that. Again, additional police substations, fire expansions and upgrades, park expansions and improvements, and so on. So as growth is coming in, it's placing an impact and a demand for these services in a significant way. And in terms of average daily visitors, this was one bullet I didn't want to miss. Back in 2015, when we did the last analysis for the city, the average daily visitors was about 30,000. If you scale it across time and average it for a day, it's increased now to almost about 55,000 per day, even higher than that. So there's been some significant growth there as well. That's also placing demands for these services and facilities.
Yeah, so we're at not annual, but overall, a 66% increase in permanent population since 2010, and a 83% increase in visitor population since 2015.
Yeah, very significant growth you've all been having. The other prong here is in terms of significant increases in costs. And so, in terms of asset acquisition and construction, just for a sense of scale here, police vehicles in the plan right now, with all the related equipment to bring them into service, are estimated about $85,000. And that's, again, with all the equipment. 5+ years ago, it was about $45,000 or $50,000. So just the cost to bring a vehicle, to bring on an officer into service has increased dramatically. And this is something we've also seen on the fire side as well. And this is with municipalities across the state where vehicle costs and apparatus costs have increased materially, especially over the past 5 years. In the prior analysis, ladder truck was about $900,000. Now they're going for about $2 million. With the bulk of that inflationary type increase in the past 5 years or so. And so one thing I wanted to mention was, when we look at the costs over time, and we're looking at, let's say the consumer price index, well, since 2019, that's increased by almost 30%, just in the past, 5-6 years. Construction materials index, that's just materials to build with, that's gone up over 40% since 2019. And then there's the labor cost and everything else and demand. And so what we're seeing in communities throughout the state and also with you guys is you have more growth, which is placing the demand for service like we mentioned before, and the cost to bring on those growth-related facilities has increased dramatically over the past few years, especially compared to history before that. Things were averaging rate of change maybe 3% per year, and average inflation to buy or build something. The past 5 or 6 have averaged closer to 7 or 8% per year. So that's been a rather extraordinary increase in terms of the costs that you all have to, take care of in order to provide service to growth here. One other thing I'd mention again is, in terms of those circumstances, again, it's very high population growth in terms of permanent population as well as visiting population that's driving the need for services and facilities. You have the very significant and extraordinary increases in terms of capital cost and asset acquisition as well. We even see this on the utility side. Just anecdotally, the city of Mount Dora is looking to build a new wastewater treatment facility. And when we looked at the embedded costs of their assets, that they currently have in service, if you were to think of it on a price per gallon basis of what that facility can treat, then it's about $13 per gallon. That's what they had invested. The cost to build new facilities for them was $43 per gallon of capacity. So the cost increases there were just extraordinary. And we're seeing similar movements across different municipal services, whether it's police or fire, even land for recreation and so on. So just wanted to mention that item, that this is something that folks are experiencing everywhere. In terms of, kind of summarizing conclusions here, we believe, adopting the proposed impact fees and based on, your recommendation with staff, using the extraordinary circumstance approach again so that you have the fees in place in one go, and that way you're not under-recovering in those first years and having to place that burden on your existing residents. Make sure to comply with all Florida Impact Fee Act requirements, so the 90-day grace period, the 2 workshops and everything that we're doing, and then review and update the fees in a 4-year period of time, because again, there's that timer that starts on the 4-year, and you only have 12 months to get it in, or you miss the 5-year threshold, and then you're stuck with that slower implementation protocol.
Okay.
So with that, I've done quite a bit of talking, so I'll pause now if there's any questions.
Okay, maybe get a drink of water. Yeah, I had a question on the model. So you mentioned our community is very unique. We have a high visitor population and is increased more than the permanent population. So all models do have a range of input values where they are most accurate, and then when values get to extremes, models can become less accurate. So in communities where demand is highly concentrated in a minority of land use, are there other models available other than that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 weighting for demand, inflow, outflow, and benefit due to availability?
So with that approach, it can depend on what data is available to you. In the case working with the city, we had all 3 of those data points. There are, in some communities we work with, that their call data system can't handle, they track calls by call type as opposed to by type and location. That's a very common issue, in which case we wouldn't even have demand as a component in that analysis because the data just doesn't exist. And so it can be a function of what data is available to us, how we get to the allocation factor that we're using. In this case, we had all 3 points, so we weighed them all together evenly. As far as potentially weighting them in a different manner, there's not a prescribed formula by which you can set that weighting, because there's a lot in there, like how can you quantify the potential risk for something occurring on the square footage side maybe being more than on where the people are, or vice versa. So in the event where we have, those 3 data points together, and we're trying to account for a factor that, again, accounts for not only just direct demand, but also for potential demand from those who may not have calls, or just from structure and everything themselves, we're trying to weigh that together. So yes, short version is there are methods that can use 1 or 2 of those factors and potentially weigh them differently. As far as our approach, we're looking at all of those items together and trying to make sure that we account for each one evenly and weigh them there.
Okay, so in cases where all 3 factors are available, this 1/3 weighting is the best practice?
It's how we approach it. We think it's a defensible practice because, again, we're trying to look at all the items and account for them. As far as how fees are calculated in general, the issue there is in Florida, there's lots of different ways of having the fees in place. And so there are communities that keep the design very simple, one-size-fits-all fee for everyone. Some places even do just a square footage fee for all without any sort of differentiation or even looking at some of those issues. So, and they're all valid approaches. You can also have a variance in method of calculation based on how you get to the costs that you're including in the fee. So for instance, there's a couple approaches. You can look backwards in time and just look at what you've invested through today and take that to your population today and kind of divide it out per unit. You can take it, and that'll get you your lowest fee. And if you think about it, it's because it's all older costs at older dollars. You can look forwards in time and have just look at the costs that you're anticipating to add over the next 5-10 years or something, divided out by the assumed population growth by that time, and that'll get you your highest cost per unit basis because you're using all tomorrow dollars instead of today. And so both of those are valid approaches. We take an approach that's a hybrid of that because we're also trying to account for the fact that you have existing investment in facilities that can serve your population and growth right now, as well as those growth projects. So I say all that to say there's a lot of different methods that are all valid, and they can vary on either what data is available in the development of that analysis, or maybe the unique circumstance of that community. So there's a lot of variability. So I don't want to say necessarily that one is better than another. It kind of depends on what you have available to you and what those circumstances are, and then working with staff to try to figure out, okay, what do we think is the best fit here?
Okay.
Couple things. One, in your experience, did you get provided the most data that you could to come to these conclusions, or is there data points that you would like to have seen that we were unable to provide?
No, actually, everything that we had requested to get, we got. So we received your fixed asset records in line item detail for all of the municipal services. We received your capital plan in line item project detail as well. We received 3 years of call data, I believe, for each of the departments, for police and for fire, excuse me. We had your acreage information for parks, your fixed asset data for parks, same for library. We had your comp plan in terms of what your level of service target was there. So we pretty much had everything that we had wanted.
And then another question, the methodology for industrial warehousing, especially in fire impact fees. How did you come to the $40 per 1,000 square foot? Was that mainly driven through call volume, or because I know in the fire industry, a warehouse or an industrial fire can be a lot more taxing on resources than a lot of other fires. So I'm just trying to fix that low number in my head.
So big part of the factor are those trip generation factors I mentioned earlier, the ITE items. That's probably step one in the weighting. Then we also use your square footage data by property classification to weight those factors a little more specific to your community. But as far as what you're speaking to, I think a little bit more is just like a risk coefficient. If you have some sort of flammable combustible facility that lights up, that's much bigger than maybe what's being assessed here by that method. The issue there where you have some difficulty is how do you create a risk assessment weighting factor that encompasses that, because those types of disasters, if you will, if it's something like that, they're kind of black swan events. They're kind of, to some extent, a little unique. When something horrible like that happens, it doesn't happen often, thankfully, but it's also hard to then mathematically try to build in a weighting for that component. Where you do have some room there is probably out more so on the planning and on the building side, making sure that if a facility like that is going to come online, that there are various safeguards and maybe more stringent protocols for that sort of development. So try to account for some of that there.
Okay.
Mr. Davis, I just had a question because we're coming up to our 9 o'clock meeting. Are we able to delay that meeting start time by 15 minutes?
The start time of the meeting is set by ordinance.
Okay.
So I think you can continue this discussion when you get to the item
Yeah.
on the agenda, but I would recommend that you go ahead and start
Yeah.
the meeting on time.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we'll move that to the, okay, we've gone to public hearing. We will continue the council discussion during the meeting. This meeting is adjourned. We will start the next meeting in 3 minutes. All right.
Not long enough to go anywhere.
I'll